Well, next week is the ultimate session of our series, Be My Witnesses, and Sarah's bringing the ultimate message next week. This week is the penultimate, it's the second to last one, and we're looking today from Acts chapter 17, and Mike's going to come and read our passage. Paul is in Athens at this point.
Acts 17, 16 to 34. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very things you worship. And this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others.
Thank you, Mike, and a challenge with some of those names there. Well done, Mike, for getting through those. Let's just pray. Father, thank you for your word, and may it be a light for our path, and may we hear you speak through it this morning. Amen. A woman had a teenage son who didn't seem to have any interest, despite her best efforts, in following Jesus. Every Sunday she would nag him, "Won't you come to church with us today?" Wasn't interested, just lay in bed. Every day she'd say to him, "Have you said your prayers today?" Again, wasn't interested. She even put little tracts between his pillows. And when he went to school and opened his box, there was a little tract and a little message. None of this was having any positive effect. In despair, she knelt down by her bed and she said, "God, please, please, whatever is an obstruction, an obstacle to him coming to faith in you, please remove that obstacle." And instantly, she disappeared. How would you rate yourself at witnessing? So that's the question. How would you rate yourself? Do you think you're good at witnessing? Or do you think you're not so good if you're on a scale of 0 to 10? I think a lot of us might want to rate that, be quite hesitant in terms of our rating. The truth is that actually God calls us all to witness for him, and we will witness for him. That witness can be positive, it can also be negative. And there are things we can do that can help us to be better in terms of our witness. And we're going to have a think about some of these things this morning that we learn and glean from our passage. The story this morning is based in the magnificent city of Athens. This was visited by Paul during his second missionary tour. Established as the epicenter for philosophical thought back in the 5th century BC, it was home to Socrates, not the footballer, the philosopher, Plato, and Aristotle. It contained some of the most spectacular buildings, including the Pantheon, which is here. That would have been there when Paul went. And exuding confidence in its intellectual might. The Areopagus, also known as the Hill of Ares or Mars Hill, is close to the Pantheon. And it was a meeting place where a council of intellectuals, of worthies, would gather. And there they would judge moral issues, but they would also judge philosophical ideas. Paul is invited to address this council at the Areopagus to explain his new teaching, his new ideas to the intellectual elite of Athens. I'm interested by Luke's dismissive comment of what's going on at Athens and the intellectualism. You may have picked this out. Verse 21, Luke says this. He says, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking and listening to the latest ideas. He doesn't rate this academic world, it doesn't seem. Get a life, he is saying. Let's reflect firstly on how Paul encounters Athens. Firstly, I want to say Paul sees. And I think the passage wants us to pick up on this. Verse 16, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. And when Paul talks to the Areopagus and talks about what his message is, he begins by saying, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. I looked carefully, he said. The word used here indicates more than just a casual glance. The word is used 3 times, once in verse 16, once in 22, once in 23. For see is actually quite an intense word. It has the idea of observing, of perceiving, of considering, a sort of intensity in looking at things. Henry Martin studied maths at Cambridge in the early 19th century. He was a senior wrangler, which actually means he came top of the undergraduates 1 year, which is some achievement in mathematics. He was brilliant at maths, and yet he sensed the call of God to go and serve God overseas. He went as a missionary to India, and he proved to be brilliant at translation as well. He translated the whole of the New Testament into Urdu and into Persian. He died of a fever aged just 31, but by then had laid a significant foundation in his translation work for other missionaries to build later in terms of reaching out to Muslims. On arriving in Calcutta, he was asked if he would be really a worker, a pastor to the Westerners who were there. They saw his brilliance, they wanted him for themselves. But he felt compelled that he was to try and reach out to locals, and he refused that offer that was put before him. And the compulsion was fueled in part, according to his diaries, by one day when he witnessed a Hindu procession soon after he arrived. He wrote this in his diary. He said, before the stumps of images, for they were not better, some of the people prostrated themselves, striking the ground twice with their foreheads. This excited more horror in me than I can well express. I thought that if I had words, I would preach to the multitudes all day, even if I lost my life for it. See, he sees what is going on, he sees their practices, and he not only sees it, he notices He really sees what's happening. He has, if you like, a spiritual vision, and that creates within him a hunger. The first starting point is Paul sees, and I wonder how well we see what is going on around us in spiritual terms. Secondly, Paul feels. It goes hand in hand. It says in verse 16, he was greatly distressed. What he saw moved him profoundly. And actually, the NIV, I think, is right. It moved him negatively. Other translations use phrases such as he was deeply disturbed, he was greatly upset, he was greatly angered, it uses in one translation. His spirit was provoked within him. It's not a coincidence that the word used here is the word that the the Greek translation of the Old Testament uses for God's reaction to idols. Here, Paul is reacting. He feels a disturbance that mirrors God's reaction to idol worship, an observing of the futility of worshipping man-made images rather than the living God. There's an idea of jealousy associated with this word. Paul is jealous for God, that the creator and sustainer of life should alone be worshipped, and actually people are giving this worship to these things that they've crafted in their workshops. Worship should be given to God and God alone. When I went to China for the first time, nearly 20 years ago, I visited a Tibetan monastery town, one of 5 Tibetan monastery towns in Shahe. There we saw a religiosity that I hadn't encountered before. Let me show you 3 pictures. The first one shows people prostrating themselves in prayer over and over again. These women were just bowing down and getting up and bowing down. This just went on as long as we were there. This wasn't just twice, 3 times. This was just on, minute after minute, 10 minutes after 10 minutes, just continuing to do that. Other people, there's lots of prayer wheels there, if you've ever seen these pictures. People were just walking around these prayer wheels, spinning them. These prayer wheels go on for hundreds and hundreds of yards. This is one way you just walk round and round, and this person's just walking round and round and round and round and round. And then we saw people doing pilgrimages. And if you see at the bottom of this picture, you see these people lying on the ground. They're doing body pilgrimages. They move one body length at a time. They lie down, prostrate themselves, then get up, and then lie down, prostrate themselves. And they can do this for months on end. Even over a year, people can do these pilgrimages, day in, day out. In what they're doing, they were hoping that somehow the gods would look favorably on them. And it felt desperate. And whilst it was fascinating and interesting, and there's something commendable about their devotion and what they do, but on the other, as a Christian, I felt deeply disturbed by this, because actually God hasn't made it difficult for us to know him. God has made himself available in and through Jesus Christ. And they just they didn't know this. And I prayed that God would come and help them to find Jesus, because he doesn't ask us to work like this, to strive, to worship in other ways. He invites us to come to him through Jesus Christ. It's right that when we see things that are not right as we know them, that we feel we are deeply disturbed. It's right that we see and we feel. Paul, when he went to Athens, he saw and he felt, he was moved. And that resulted in Paul then doing things. The third thing, very simply, Paul acts. He turns his strong feelings. Sometimes we turn our strong feelings into negative action, destructive action. He turns it into positive action. And for Paul, what he does as an evangelist is he proclaims Jesus. This is what is in his DNA. This is how he is wired. We might turn our feelings into other action, but for Paul, his natural way of turning these feelings are actually just to tell people who Jesus is, and he was effective at it. But he does so in 3 different settings, and I think this is significant. Firstly, he goes to the synagogue, verse 17. He reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks. And then he goes to the marketplace. Now, the marketplace was a place where everyone would pass by, the rich and the poor, the prosperous and the destitute, laborers and the intellectuals. Everyone would use the marketplace at some point. And Paul was there, sharing Jesus, contesting that Jesus is the way in the marketplace. It says, verse 17, he reasoned in the synagogue, both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace. He's trying to tell this message to everyone. And then the third place is he takes the message to the intellectual elite of the Areopagus, a very different audience. And it's only possible because he is given an invitation by Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. They've heard him in the marketplace, and they say, come and share with this wider council, this intellectual elite. A bit like going to sort of a council of philosophers at Oxford University to judge what you're saying. These places and locations are very different to each other. And yet Paul's response to what he sees and feels is to proclaim Jesus wherever he can. And no one noticed, Yvonne. You're all right. No one noticed. It's terrible, isn't it? We've all been there. I want to say 4 things we can learn from Paul's approach to witnessing in Athens. And let me just say, what Paul does is not what most of us are going to do, because we are wired differently. But 4 things I think we can learn. I don't think most of us will be in Sheep Street tomorrow talking to passers-by, because we're not wired that way, and that's not our gifting. There might be 1 or 2 of us that do that, but most of us won't be. But what can we learn from these messages? I think one of the first things is we need to start where people are at. You know the old joke of the driver who asks a pedestrian for directions to a place across town, and the pedestrian takes a deep breath and says, oh, it's not easy, from here. I think what I do is I'd start somewhere else. Sometimes our witnessing does not start at the place people need it to start. Sometimes our witnessing does not start from where people are at. It starts possibly with what we want to say, rather than with what people would benefit from hearing from us. When Paul addressed the Jewish community in the synagogue, he argued that Jesus was the promised Messiah. He would have assumed all the background of there being one God, a creator God, the sustainer of life, who has made us in his image, who is coming one day to judge the whole world. He'd have assumed all that because that was common knowledge. And he would have proclaimed Jesus as the promised Messiah according to the Old Testament scriptures. But when he gets to the Areopagus, there's no such common foundation, no such common knowledge. So Paul actually begins by contending some of these things that are there, absolutely essential to the message of Jesus. That there is a God who's created all things, that God is a sustainer of life. He's sovereign over all things and all nations, that we are made in his image, we're his offspring, and that one day he will hold all of us to account, a day that he's set for judgment. None of this needed to be taught about in the synagogue, because that was agreed knowledge. But when he gets to the Areopagus, there's a whole plethora of ideas, and he needs to start at this place. He starts where they're at. What we say when we're witnessing will vary according to who we're talking to, who we're sharing our faith. If we're talking to someone who has a Christian background, actually that's going to change what we say. We can assume things that they understand about the message that we say. If we talk to someone who has no knowledge of Christianity at all, we will need to perhaps start and explain some things that we wouldn't otherwise. If we talk to someone from a different religion, it will affect what we're saying. And what I'm saying is that we don't simply, witnessing isn't about us having one script that we simply read out to everyone and almost download. It's about us talking with people and sharing what we have found, but doing so in a way, starting where people are at and in a way that is helpful to them. Secondly, let me say, Paul finds connecting points. Impressively, he quotes 2 Greek philosophers to this group of intellectuals. I think he is extremely brave here. One is a 6th century BC poet, Epimenides. In him we live and move and have our being. And they're all thinking, oh, I know that quote. And then he quotes another 3rd century poet, Aratus. We are his offspring. I think these are points of connection, bridges that Paul uses, so that the message that he's bringing somehow connects with what they already know. Former General Secretary of the Church Missionary Society, Max Warren, he said this. He said, our first task in approaching another people, another culture, another religion, is to take off our shoes, for the place we are approaching is holy. Else we may find ourselves treading on men's dreams. More serious still, we may forget that God was here before our arrival. That's a really wise thing to say. When we go and we talk with somebody, about faith, about what we have found, actually we need to remember that God will already have been working in their life or in their community. We are not ever cold calling. In fact, we are joining in with what God is already doing. There will be points of connection. There will be things that they will understand about God, that they will have experienced about God. We need to remember that there are these points of connections, these bridges. Let me then say thirdly, Paul adopts a style that is appropriate for the setting. In the higher academic and debating world of elite philosophers, Paul argues, debates, contends, because this is appropriate for their setting. He's confrontational. That's okay, because this is a norm for that environment. When you're at work tomorrow in your coffee break, if you stand up and declare to your colleagues that you are ignorant and I'm going to show you a right way, and you stand up and you do it, I'm not sure that will go down very well and be very helpful. I mentioned to you about a street preacher in Bicester a couple of weeks ago. I don't want to be overly critical, but this person was just saying things about people being sinners, about them involved in all sorts of wrong things, and he was trying to tell people that they needed Jesus, and people were just avoiding this person. He had a microphone. They were just walking as far away from him as they could, just skirting the edges. I think the difficulty, it wasn't that what he's saying was wrong. It was the context of where it was being said. It actually wasn't the message. It just wasn't the right place, the things, the way of connecting. He wasn't finding those things. We need to find what is appropriate for our setting, sharing in a way that is appropriate with the people that we're sharing with. We do need, within Christianity, people who will argue and debate. I have been very impressed, and some of us have known the work of OCCA, Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, including John Lennox. John Lennox's sister-in-law was Richard Cutting's wife, a former minister of the church here. Brilliant academics. They would debate and argue. They had these big debates some years ago with the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. There's a place where the intellectual debate happens, but it probably isn't a place that most of us will engage with. We need people to do it, but we also need people who are going to talk to school mums at the school gate, school dads at the school gate. We need people who can share Jesus with those who are on 0-hour contracts in the hospitality industry. We need people who can share with people who've got an interest in sport, with prisoners, with children, with addicts, with youth, with business people. We need people in all walks of life, and the way we share Jesus will vary according to the context we're in. There isn't a blueprint for any and every context. And what we see in Paul here is we see him adopting an approach that is appropriate for that setting. I think that's what we learn from this passage. Let me say then, fourthly and finally, Paul's witnessing was birthed out of a passion. And we need to have that passion for God and for other people. Witnessing is birthed out of a passion. Twofold. We care about people. We want them to know who God is. And we care about God's glory. We want him to be honored. These two things are not in conflict with each other. Actually, we sing the song, don't we, by City of Light, for his glory and my good. You know, it's for his glory and my good. Those two things go together. When God is glorified, we are blessed. And when we are blessed, God is glorified. It is good when people come to know and find faith in Jesus. It's for their good, but it is also for God's glory. The difference between praise and witnessing is essentially one of location. In church this morning, we have praised. And what we've done to one another, we have sung songs to God, yes, but also to one another, declaring how good God is, declaring his goodness, his kindness, his grace, his love, his compassion. And when we witness, that's what we're doing. We're doing it in a different context. We are declaring to others who perhaps haven't yet found out for themselves how good God is, his goodness, his kindness, his love, his grace, his compassion. The difference between praise and witnessing isn't great. They're just different contexts. So, are you good at witnessing? Many of us will think, oh, I'm not very good at that. And yet, actually, we've all got a role to play. We've got to find our way of doing it. We're not all going to be Paul. We're not all going to do what Paul did. And that's probably quite good, because the world doesn't need a world of Pauls. It did need a Paul, but not a world of Pauls. Whatever form our witness takes, we need to start where people are at. We need to find those connecting points, those bridging points, to help people understand what we're sharing, to see what God is already doing. And we need to witness in a way appropriate to our context, which sometimes actually means we don't say very much, because some of our contexts don't warrant that. They will see in us, they will know we're Christians, and we'll say more through our actions and our behaviour. In 1820, a man called George Baker, he was Baptist minister of Wimborne in Dorset. He was distressed because his teenage son had cut himself off from the church. As far as anyone could see, cut himself off from God. The clergyman's wife became ill, suffered a great deal, and sadly died. Sometime later, his son's life took a dramatic turn, and he announced that he had come to faith in Christ. When his father asked him eagerly, "Which sermon was it that led you to Christ?" he replied, "It was the silent one my mother gave as she bore her suffering." We witness in different ways, many ways. We do so because we are passionate for God's glory and because we love others, and it's the best for others that they will come to know the Creator God who made them for relationship with him. May God help us in our witnessing in the coming days. Amen.